Snow doesn't fall in Alaska. It arrives. It comes down sideways, in sheets, like the sky has an opinion about you, and it isn't a kind one. I remember losing the trail marker I'd been following for an hour, the orange paint swallowed whole by white. I remember the sound disappearing first. Not the wind. The wind screamed the whole time. But every other sound, my own footsteps, my own breathing, gone. Like the storm had reached inside my chest and turned something off. I remember thinking, with strange calm, that I was going to die 800 miles from anyone who would notice for at least 4 days. And then a shape, not a bear, not a rock, a shape that moved on purpose, cutting sideways through the white like it had done this before. A hand closed around my arm hard enough to bruise, and a voice, flat and unbothered, said the first words I ever heard from Betany Cole. "You're going the wrong way." I want to tell you this story slowly, because it happened to me slowly, even though it started in about 4 minutes of a woman half carrying me through a whiteout. I'm Louise Farrow. Before any of this, you'd have known me, if you knew me at all, as the photographer who got the National Geographic cover 2 winters ago, the one of the caribou herd crossing the frozen river at dusk. That photo bought me a plane ticket to Lisbon, a 2-year contract shooting for a magazine that pays real money, and exactly 9 days to get one last shot of the Chugach Range before the season closed, and I closed with it. I did not plan on getting lost. I did not plan on nearly dying. I certainly did not plan on Betany Cole's cabin, which appeared out of the storm like something conjured, low and square and glowing orange at the windows, wood smoke bent sideways by the wind. She didn't ask questions until she'd gotten me inside, peeled off my gloves herself because my fingers wouldn't cooperate, and shoved a mug of something dark and bitter into my hands. Only then did she look at me properly. And I looked back. She was maybe 5 years older than me. Hair pulled back under a wool cap, a face that had spent a decade being weathered by exactly this kind of cold, eyes the pale gray blue of lake ice. She had the stillness of someone who lived alone on purpose. "Ranger station's not due a supply drop for 3 days, she said, like she was already annoyed at the math. "Storm might clear before that. You got somewhere to be?" "I'm leaving when the snowstorm passes," I told her, meaning it as reassurance, meaning it as I won't be a burden. She almost smiled. It changed her whole face, briefly, before she caught it. "Then I hope it never does." I laughed, because it was funny, because I thought it was flirting, the easy kind you do with strangers you'll never see again. I didn't know yet that she meant it 3 different ways, and only one of them was a joke. If you're new here, welcome. I'm glad you found this story, and if this is the kind of thing that gets you right in the chest the way it did me, hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. And I want to know, have you ever met someone in the worst possible moment of your life and known somehow, immediately, that it wasn't actually the worst moment? It was the beginning of something? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. She gave me the second bunk, apologized for the state of it. Nobody stayed here but her, hadn't in years, and told me the outhouse required a headlamp and a death wish, so I'd be using the indoor bucket like a normal person until the storm broke. It was, somehow, one of the more romantic things anyone had said to me in a decade, delivered with the same flat competence she used for everything. I lay awake that first night, listening to the wind take the roof apart plank by plank, or so it sounded, and I could hear her in the next room, not sleeping either, the particular quality of someone else's stillness that tells you they're awake. At some point near dawn, I heard her get up, heard the stove door, heard her feed the fire without a single wasted motion, like she'd done it 10,000 times because she had. I thought about my flight, Lisbon, in 9 days. I thought about the caribou photograph, the one that started all of this, the one that was supposed to be the last thing I shot before I stopped being someone who ran toward remote, cold, empty places, and started being someone who lived, for once, somewhere with room service. I did not think, that first night, that the emptiest, coldest, most remote place I would ever end up was the one with a woman in it, who already, impossibly, felt like something I didn't want to leave. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and sat by the window, watching the storm throw itself against the glass with a violence that should have terrified me, and instead felt, oddly, like company. I heard her moving in the other room again, not restless, just careful. The sound of someone who had spent so many winters alone that silence itself had become a kind of conversation partner. At one point she passed by my doorway, saw I was awake, and didn't say anything about it. She just set another blanket on the end of my bunk without a word and kept walking, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like taking care of a stranger she'd pulled half-frozen out of a whiteout was simply what a Tuesday required of her. I lay there afterward, turning the gesture over in my mind, longer than it deserved, or maybe exactly as long as it deserved, and I couldn't decide which. Morning came gray and still furious outside, but inside, there was coffee. And there was Betany at the stove in a flannel shirt with the sleeves shoved up, moving around her own kitchen with the unconscious authority of someone who had never had to make room for another person in it, and was, I could tell, recalibrating in real time. "You always drink it black?" she asked, not turning around. "How do you know I drink it black?" "You didn't ask for cream. Man, woman, whoever. Everybody who wants cream asks in the first 10 seconds. I filed that away. She noticed things. She noticed things about people the way I noticed light. Automatically, constantly, before she'd decided to. We talked that morning, in the loose, testing way of two people figuring out how much space the other one needs. I learned she'd been a ranger here for 11 years, this station for 6 of them, that she requested the isolated postings on purpose, that she liked the radio silence more than most people liked company. I told her about the magazine job, the 2-year contract, the flight out of Anchorage I was supposed to make in 9 days, and watched something in her face go carefully neutral. The specific neutral of a person protecting themselves from caring about an answer. "Storm like this?" she said. "The road out doesn't always open on schedule." "How not on schedule are we talking?" "Depends on the storm." She said it like a fact and not a warning, but I heard the warning anyway. I spent the rest of the morning watching her work, checking the woodpile, clearing a path from the door to the shed with a shovel she wielded like it weighed nothing. Splitting logs with an economy of motion, I found myself wanting to photograph, badly, professionally, the kind of wanting that lives in your hands. I asked if I could shoot her working. She said no, twice, and then, on the third ask, shrugged like it cost her something to agree and let me follow her around with my camera for an hour. I got a shot of her silhouetted against the woodshed door, axe raised, snow coming down around her like she was standing inside a storm that had decided, for once, to be beautiful instead of dangerous. I didn't show her the photo. I wanted to keep it for myself a little while longer. That evening she made stew from things I didn't ask too many questions about. And when I shivered reaching for the salt, she got up without a word and dropped a blanket over my shoulders, hand resting there half a second longer than the task required. Neither of us mentioned it. I felt it for an hour afterward like a brand. "Why here?" I asked her later, when the fire had burned low and the wind outside had settled into something almost gentle. "Of all the postings, why the one nobody wants?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. "Because nobody wants it," she said finally. "That was the whole point, once. I didn't push. I recognized the shape of a door left slightly open and the particular cruelty of shoving it wide before someone's ready. I'd had that done to me before. I wasn't going to do it to her. Instead, I asked her what the quietest sound in the world was, and she thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything, and said, "Snow landing on more snow." I wrote it down in the notebook I keep for captions I'll never use, because some things are for the photograph, and some things are just for you. Later, when the fire had burned down to embers and the wind outside had softened into something almost like breathing, She told me about the first winter she'd spent here, back before she trusted the isolation to hold her the way it eventually did. She said she used to talk to herself out loud, just to remember the sound of a voice, hers included, and that it had taken almost a full year before the silence stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a choice she was allowed to make on purpose. I asked her if she still talked to herself. She admitted, a little sheepishly, that she did, mostly to the wood stove, occasionally to the dog she'd had years back and never replaced, and for the last 3 days, apparently to me, in her head, more than she wanted to admit. I told her I did the same thing behind a camera, narrated the whole world to myself in captions, half-formed sentences meant for nobody, a habit that had gotten louder the lonelier my life had gotten. We sat with that shared confession for a while. Two people who had each built careful architectures around being alone, comparing blueprints without quite realizing that was what we were doing. The radio crackled to life on the third morning with news that undid whatever fragile peace I'd built around a 3-day timeline. The system stalled over the range, roads impassable for at least 2 more weeks, maybe 3. Betany relayed this flatly, watching my face for the reaction she clearly expected. Panic, calculation, the beginning of some frantic plan to helicopter me out of her life and back into my own. I surprised myself by feeling, underneath the panic, something that took me an embarrassingly long time to name as relief. I have a contract, I told her, mostly to remind myself. A start date. People expecting me. People in Lisbon can wait 2 weeks for a photographer stuck in an Alaskan whiteout, she said. It's not exactly an unheard-of excuse. You've done this before? Rescued careless photographers and held them hostage with good stew? That almost smile again, quick and gone. First time for everything. I called my new editor from the radio, static eating half my sentences, and negotiated a delay I told myself was purely practical. Then I turned around and found something to do with my hands, because Betany was watching me with an expression I didn't have a name for yet, and it was easier to point a camera at something than to sit inside that look. I asked if I could photograph her properly. Not candid, not stolen shots while she worked, but portraits, her choosing how she wanted to be seen for once. She said she didn't do that. I told her nobody has to see them but us. That got a real laugh out of her, short and surprised, like it had escaped before she could stop it. She let me set up by the window, gray light falling flat and even across her face, and for the first time, she looked directly into the lens instead of past it. I lowered the camera without taking the shot. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You're just good at this. Being looked at. When you decide to let it happen. Nobody's looked at me on purpose in a long time." I took the photograph then, because I understood suddenly that this sentence was the truest thing she'd told me, and I wanted proof it had been said out loud, once, to somebody. She asked to see it afterward, which surprised me, because she'd told me at the start she didn't do this, didn't sit for cameras, didn't like the particular vulnerability of being studied. She looked at the screen a long time, quiet, and then handed it back like it was heavier than it should have been. "You made me look like someone worth photographing," she said. "You were always that. I just finally had the right light." She laughed at that, called it a line, accused me of stealing it from a movie, and I told her I'd been saving it for the right person for years and hadn't found one until now. I realized as soon as I'd said it, the truest thing I'd told her yet, and judging by the way she went quiet again, she'd heard it that way too. We spent the afternoon with her showing me the station's small archive. Decades of ranger logs, weather patterns, a hand-drawn map of the whole valley she'd made herself over the years, precise and strange and beautiful. The private cartography of someone who had spent a decade paying enormous attention to a place nobody else was watching. I recognized something in it. It was the same thing I did with a camera, just slower, and with more patience than I had ever managed to have with anything. "You made all of this yourself?" I asked, tracing a finger along a ridgeline she'd rendered so carefully it looked almost topographic. Elevation shifts marked in a code only she understood. Nobody else was going to. And somebody should know this place the way it actually is, not the way it looks on a government survey map from 1992. She said it a little defensively, like she expected me to find it strange. This decade of unpaid, unwitnessed devotion to a valley most people would never set foot in. I didn't find it strange. I found it, if anything, the most romantic thing I'd encountered in years. Not romantic toward me, just romantic as a way of being in the world, paying this much attention to something for no reason except that it deserved it. I told her so, and she went quiet in the way she did when a compliment landed somewhere she hadn't built defenses for yet. That night, splitting the last of the good bread, she asked about my last relationship, direct in the way she asked everything, no cushioning. I told her the short version. A woman who wanted me home more than I wanted to be home, who called my work a way of running, who wasn't entirely wrong. Betany listened without offering an opinion, which I appreciated more than I expected to. "And the woman before her?" she asked, sensing there was one. "Same story, different city." "That a pattern you've noticed, or a pattern I'm noticing for you?" I didn't have an answer for that. I went to bed early, unsettled, and lay awake listening to her bank the fire, and thought about patterns, and thought about how she'd looked at the camera when she finally let herself be seen. I found the photograph by accident, tucked in the back of the station log, where Betany clearly hadn't meant for it to be found. A woman with dark hair, younger Betany beside her, both laughing at something outside the frame, taken maybe 8 years ago on a porch I recognized as this one. I put it back exactly where I'd found it and said nothing. And then, 3 days later, unable to help myself, asked anyway. "Her name was Denny," Betany said, not angry that I'd asked, which told me she'd been waiting for someone too. "We were together 4 years. She wanted a life. I wanted this posting. Turned out those were the same conversation eventually. She left because of the isolation. She left because I chose the isolation over her, more than once, and called it duty long enough that she stopped believing it was ever really about the job." Betany said this without self-pity, delivering it like a weather report, a fact about conditions rather than a wound. I told myself I liked being alone, told myself for 6 years. It's a good story if you tell it enough times. I understood then, the shape of the fear underneath her flatness. Not that she'd end up alone, but that she'd choose it again, the way she had before, and call it something nobler than what it was. "Is that why the joke?" I asked, about hoping it never passes. Wasn't entirely a joke. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. So I did what I always do when I don't know what to do. I picked up the camera and stood at the window and photographed the snow instead of her face, giving both of us somewhere else to look. That night she showed me how to read the sky for the next system, patient in a way I hadn't expected from someone so economical with her words, hand occasionally brushing mine as she pointed at a cloud formation, neither of us commenting on it, both of us noticing. "You're better at this than you let on," she said, meaning the reading of weather. But I heard it as something else too, some larger comment about attention, about presence, about the difference between passing through a place and actually seeing it. "I read light for a living. Weather's just light with opinions." That got the real laugh again, and this time she didn't try to catch it before it escaped. Later, banking the fire, our hands met, reaching for the same log, and this time neither of us pulled away first. We stood like that a beat too long, her hand under mine, the fire between us throwing orange light up across both our faces. And I understood I was in more danger from this woman than I had ever been from the storm that brought me to her. "I should go to bed," I said, meaning I should put distance between us before I do something I can't take back. "You should," she agreed, meaning the exact same thing, and neither of us moved for another 3 full seconds before we did. I lay awake a long time after that, replaying the 3 seconds like they were footage I could rewind, trying to decide if I'd imagined the way her hand had tightened slightly under mine before she let go. In the next room, I could hear her not sleeping either. The same restless quiet I'd learned to recognize in my first night here. And for the first time, it didn't feel lonely to lie there listening to it. It felt like we were doing the same thing in separate rooms, which was, I was starting to understand, its own kind of closeness. In the morning, she didn't mention it, and neither did I, but she made my coffee before I'd even asked, remembered without being told that I took it black, and set it down in front of me with a small, private smile that told me the moment by the fire hadn't been forgotten. It had just been filed away somewhere we weren't ready to open yet. Something shifted after that, settled into an easier register, the specific comfort of 2 people who have stopped performing for each other and started just existing in the same space. She started leaving her door open a crack at night, where before she'd always closed it firmly, and I noticed the change immediately and said nothing, because some shifts are better left unremarked until the person making them is ready to talk about why. We developed rituals without discussing them. She made coffee. I made the fire bigger than it needed to be because I liked the excuse to be near the hearth when she was near it too. We invented a running joke about the outhouse and the headlamp that made no sense to anyone but us, and that was exactly the point. She taught me to identify animal tracks in the snow, the neat precision of a fox, the drag-heavy print of a moose, the way you could tell how recently something had passed by, how sharp the edges still were before the wind softened them. I taught her, in turn, how to see the way a photographer sees, how light changes the same object into 6 different objects depending on the hour, how the best shot is rarely the obvious one. "Show me," she said one afternoon, meaning show me what you see when you look at me. And I understood it as the bravest thing she'd said all week. I turned the camera toward her without a plan, just instinct, and caught her mid-laugh at something I'd said, unguarded, the wool cap pushed back, a strand of dark hair loose across her forehead that she hadn't bothered to fix. I showed her the screen. She went quiet, studying it. "I don't look like that," she said. "You look exactly like that. You've just never had a mirror pointed at the right moment before." That evening, for no reason either of us could name afterward, we danced in the small kitchen to a station crackling faintly through her old radio. Nothing romantic about it at first. Just 2 people being ridiculous because the storm outside made everything indoors feel a little bit like its own separate world with its own separate rules. She spun me under her arm clumsily, both of us laughing too hard to do it properly, and when the song ended we were standing closer than the dance required, both of us aware of it, neither of us moving. "I like this," she said, quiet, meaning the kitchen, the dancing, the nearness, all of it at once. "Which part?" "All of it. That's the problem." I understood the problem without her explaining it. Liking all of it meant the storm passing would cost something now. In a way it hadn't the first week. When I was still a stranger, she'd pulled out of the snow and not someone whose laugh she'd started listening for. That night, I lay in my bunk and thought, with something like alarm, that I hadn't checked the weather radio out of curiosity about my flight in 4 days. I had stopped, without noticing exactly when, hoping for the same thing she'd joked about on the first night. I got up quietly and stood at the window watching the snow come down steady and unbothered and thought, I am waiting for this storm to pass, and I don't want it to. And underneath that, quieter, the thought I wasn't ready for yet. I think I am doing, on purpose this time, the thing I've run from every time before. I thought about calling my sister, the way I used to when a relationship started tipping from casual into something with weight, wanting her usual bracing honesty to talk me down from whatever this was. I didn't call. Some part of me understood already that there was no version of this conversation where a voice from 4,000 miles away could talk me out of what was actually happening 8 feet from my own bunk, and that maybe, for the first time, I didn't want to be talked out of it at all. When I finally went back to sleep, it was with the window still cracked an inch, cold air needling in. Because I found I liked hearing the storm now instead of dreading it. The way you like the sound of rain once you've finally found somewhere warm and certain to listen to it from. Company like this makes room for confessions that daylight and other people usually keep sealed shut. It was Betany who opened the door first, telling me one night, unprompted, about the year after Denny left. The year she barely spoke to another human being and told herself it was peace instead of what it actually was, which was grief, wearing peace as a disguise. I told her, in return, about the relationship before my last one, the one I don't usually mention, the one where I confused being controlled for being cared about until a friend finally said the sentence out loud that broke the spell. I told her how I'd been running literally, professionally, geographically, ever since, and calling it ambition. "You don't seem like someone who runs," she said. "I'm extremely good at it. That's the whole trick. Nobody clocks the running if you frame it as a career." She was quiet a long moment, and then she reached over and took my hand, not romantically, or not only romantically. It felt more like an anchor, like she was holding something steady that had been drifting a long time. I let her. I didn't examine why it felt like the safest thing that had happened to me in years. "You can stay still sometimes," she said. "It doesn't have to be the same as being stuck." I cried a little, which embarrassed me, and she didn't try to fix it or rush me out of it, just sat with her hand in mine while I got it out of my system. And when I was done, she made tea without commentary, like this was a normal Tuesday, and not the night I told a near stranger the truest thing about myself. We fell asleep on the same side of the room that night for the first time, not touching, just near, her breathing slow and even a few feet away. And I lay awake a long time listening to it, thinking about anchors, thinking about how a person can spend a decade convinced that stillness is a trap and then meet somebody who makes stillness feel like the first safe thing they've ever stood on. The storm outside hadn't let up. If anything, it had worsened, the kind of weather that made the radio crackle warnings about a full system stall, potentially another 10 days minimum before the pass cleared. I should have been anxious about that. Instead, hearing the number, I felt something loosen in my chest that I recognized with some discomfort, as gladness. In the morning, over coffee, Betany told me a story I hadn't asked for, about the winter Denny left. How she'd driven her to the airstrip herself in a whiteout nearly as bad as the one that brought me here. How neither of them had said much on the drive because there wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in the 6 months of fighting before it. How she'd watched the little bush plane lift off and had driven back to an empty cabin and simply sat in it. Not crying, just sitting for most of a day. "I don't tell people that story," she said. "It doesn't make me look good." I let her go without much of a fight, because some cowardly part of me was almost relieved I wouldn't have to keep choosing between her and this place every single season. "You're telling me now. I'm telling you now because I don't want to make the same mistake twice, and I figure the only way not to is to say the true things earlier this time, even the ones that don't flatter me." I understood, hearing that she wasn't just handing me a piece of her history. She was handing me a warning label, an honest one, the kind most people are too proud to attach to themselves before it's too late to matter. I told her I appreciated it, and meant it, and reached for her hand across the small table without entirely deciding to, and she let me take it. And we sat like that a while, 2 confessions resting easily against each other in the quiet. "Before we keep going, if you're the kind of person who falls hard for stories like this one, I actually write a lot more of them than what makes it to this channel. Over on Patreon, I've got longer, deeper stories with these 2 and other couples entirely, full of the quieter chapters and bonus scenes that don't always fit a single video. If you want more of that world, it's there waiting for you. Okay, back to the cabin. It happened over something small, the way these things always do. A comment I made about maybe extending my contract delay again, said lightly, testing the water, and Betany going very still in a way I'd learned, meant she was protecting herself from something. "Don't do that," she said. Do what? Say things like that like they don't cost anything. Like you can float the idea of staying and then get on a plane in 2 weeks and I just absorb it. I'm not floating an idea. I'm telling you I don't want to leave yet. Yet is the whole problem, Louise. Her voice wasn't raised. It never raised. But there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before. I did this before. I let someone matter. And then their real life called them back to it. And I told myself it was fine because at least I got the time I got. I'm not doing the sequel. That's not fair. I'm not her. I know you're not. That's what makes it worse, actually, because it means I don't get to use the old excuse for why I shouldn't let this happen again. We didn't speak for the rest of that day, moving around the small cabin with the exaggerated care of 2 people avoiding a bruise, and I spent it turning her words over, understanding, slowly, that the fear wasn't really about me leaving. It was about her having chosen, once already, to let isolation be safer than risk, and hating how easily I'd undone 6 years of that choice in under 2 weeks. That night I found her outside checking the woodpile in weather that didn't need checking, using the task as an excuse to be away from the cabin, from me, from the conversation neither of us had finished. I went out without a coat because I wasn't thinking clearly, and she turned around and told me to get back inside before I froze, and I told her I wasn't going anywhere until we'd actually said the thing out loud. I don't know what happens when the road opens, I said, teeth chattering, refusing to go in. I don't have a 5-year plan for this. I have a job I love and a life I built specifically, so nobody could ever make me stay somewhere I didn't choose. And somehow the first time in a decade I've wanted to choose staying. It's here, with you, in a place I got lost trying to leave. She looked at me a long moment, snow catching in her eyelashes, and something in her face cracked open. I'm scared, she said simply, the first time she'd said the word out loud about anything. I'm scared I'm going to let myself need you and then you'll go, and I'll have talked myself back into needing nothing again. And I don't know if I can do that a second time and survive it. I didn't have an answer that fixed it. I just took her hand and said we'd figure out the actual answer later, but that I wasn't finishing this conversation by lying to either of us about how much this had already stopped being simple. She nodded, and we went back inside together, and neither of us pretended the fight hadn't happened, which felt somehow like more progress than pretending everything was fine would have been. Inside, she put the kettle on without being asked, an old habit of hers for smoothing over hard conversations with something warm to hold, and we sat across from each other at the small table, not quite ready to talk again yet, just letting the adrenaline of the fight drain out of the room slowly. I don't actually want you to promise anything, she said eventually, turning her mug in slow circles. I've had promises before. They're easy to make in a cabin during a storm. I'd rather you just keep telling me the truth as it changes, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's not what I want to hear. That I can do, I said. That's actually the only thing I know how to offer anybody. I've just never had someone ask for it plainly like that before. Well, she said, the ghost of her almost smile returning for the first time since the fight started. I'm asking. We didn't solve anything else that night. Not really. But something had shifted back into alignment. The particular relief of 2 people who've said the hard thing out loud, and found the other one still sitting across the table afterward instead of gone. The forecast finally shifted. The pass would likely clear in 3 to 4 days. The real thing this time. Not a false hope like the ones before it. I felt the news land in my chest like a stone, and I noticed myself doing something I recognized immediately, with a kind of sick clarity, as a very old habit. I started photographing everything. Betany asleep in the gray early light, the exact pattern of frost on the window that morning, her hands around a coffee mug, the path to the woodshed she'd cleared 100 times. I told myself it was for the magazine, that I needed Alaska content regardless, but I knew, and she knew, watching me do it with an expression that got quieter and sadder every day, exactly what I was actually doing. I was saying goodbye in the only language I trusted. "You did this with Denny too, didn't you?" I said to her one evening, watching her watch me photograph the stove. "Before she left, started paying extra attention because you knew the ending was coming." "I don't need you to project onto me what you're doing to me," she said. And it wasn't unkind, just true, just sharp enough to actually land. She was right, and it was the thing I needed someone to say. I put the camera down. "I'm doing exactly what I did with my ex," I admitted. "Documenting things so I have proof they happened, because some part of me has already decided this is ending and I'm building the evidence file in advance." "Are you leaving?" she asked, quiet, direct as always, no cushioning. "I don't know. I have a contract. I have a life I built on purpose so I'd never be stuck anywhere again. And I have a life I built on purpose so I'd never need anybody enough for it to hurt when they left," she said. "We're the same kind of coward, Louise. We just picked different props." The words sat between us, uncomfortable and true. I thought about Lisbon, about the 2-year contract, about the caribou photograph that had bought me a life I'd wanted before I got lost in a storm and found something that made the wanting complicated. "You already know I'm leaving," she said, not a question this time, reading something in my face I hadn't said out loud yet. I didn't answer, because I didn't actually know, and the not knowing felt like its own kind of answer, one neither of us liked. She left the room after that, not angrily, just needing space the way she always did when something got too large to hold still inside, and I sat with the camera in my lap, not taking a single photograph for the first time in days, because I finally understood that some things lose their meaning the second you try to preserve them instead of just living inside them. When she came back an hour later, she didn't apologize, and neither did I, because there was nothing to apologize for, only something true that neither of us had wanted to say out loud yet. She sat down across from me, and very quietly asked to see the photographs I'd taken that week. All of them, not just the ones I'd have chosen to show her. I handed over the camera without hesitation, which surprised me more than it seemed to surprise her, and watched her scroll through 2 weeks of a life neither of us had planned on. Her face unreadable until she got to the last one, the shot of her at the window with the frost pattern beside her face, and something in her expression softened. "You weren't just documenting an ending," she said slowly, like she was working it out as she said it. "Some of these you took because you wanted them to exist, not because you were scared of losing them." "Both things can be true at once," I said. "I think that's just what this is." I woke to find her sitting by the dying fire, unable to sleep, and something about the low light and the exhaustion in both of us stripped away whatever careful distance we'd been keeping since the fight. "I don't know how to exist without you now," she said, not looking at me, saying it like a confession she'd been holding for days and could no longer carry alone. "That's the whole problem. I built a life around not needing this, and you walked into it 11 days ago, and now I don't know how to go back to before." I sat down across from her, close enough that our knees touched. "I don't want you to go back to before," I said. "I don't want to go back to my before either. I just don't know what the after looks like yet." She reached for the camera on the table between us, an unspoken question, and I understood it. She wanted, for once, to be the one deciding how she was seen, wanted to hold the thing that had always felt like exposure, and turn it, instead, into an offering. "Take one of me," she said. "The way you actually see me. Not candid, not stolen, on purpose." I did. She looked directly into the lens, unguarded in a way she'd never let herself be, and I lowered the camera afterward and just looked at her, no glass between us, and something in the room went very still and very quiet, the way a held breath goes quiet right before it's finally released. "Louise," she said. "Yeah. I need you to know this isn't just the storm talking. Isolation makes people confuse a lot of things for connection. I've had enough winters to know the difference. This isn't that. I know, I said, and I did, because I'd had the exact same worry and watched it dissolve every single day for 2 weeks against the actual evidence of her. She kissed me first, gently, like she was asking a question with her mouth instead of her words, and I answered by not pulling away, by leaning into it, by finally letting the thing we'd both been circling for 11 days land the way it had wanted to land since the first night she pulled me out of a whiteout and joked about hoping it never passed. It was soft and searching, and neither of us rushed it. Her hand coming up to rest against my jaw, like she was afraid I might be something that could dissolve if she held on too hard. When we broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine for a moment, both of us breathing unsteadily, and neither of us said anything for a long while, because there wasn't anything left that needed saying out loud just then. "If you're leaving," she said finally, quiet, "I want to remember this properly, not through a lens, just like this." We sat together a long while after that, not talking, her head against my shoulder, the fire throwing its last orange light across the room before settling into embers. I found I didn't want to fill the silence with reassurances I couldn't honestly make yet. Not a promise to stay, not a plan for after, just the plain fact of the two of us existing in the same quiet at the same time, which felt, that night, like enough. "Ask me something," she said eventually. "Something you actually want to know, not something safe. What would you do if I stayed?" She considered it seriously, the way she considered everything, weather patterns and weld joints, and now, apparently, me. "I'd probably spend the first month waiting for the other boot to drop," she admitted. "And then, if it didn't, I think I'd finally let myself believe it. That's usually how it goes with me. Slow, and then all at once." "That sounds familiar," I told her, and she laughed softly against my shoulder. And for a while, neither of us needed to say anything else at all. I won't walk you through everything that happened after that kiss, because some things are ours and not the story's. But I'll tell you this. The fire burned low, and the cabin was warm despite the storm outside, and we moved slowly, carefully, the way you do with something you've wanted a long time and don't want to rush past. At some point, she reached over and turned the lamp down, until the room was mostly firelight and shadow. And the last thing I remember clearly is her hand finding mine in the dark, steady, certain. And then the world outside the two of us simply stopped mattering for a while. I woke to gray morning light, her arm around me, her breathing slow and even against my shoulder, and I lay there a long time not moving, memorizing the exact weight of it, the exact sound of it, wanting to hold on to this specific version of quiet longer than the moment would actually allow. "You're thinking too loud," she murmured eventually, eyes still closed. "I can feel it. I'm not thinking anything. You're thinking about the road opening." I didn't deny it because she was right, and because lying to her at this point would have undone something we'd built too carefully to waste on a comfortable untruth. "Talk to me," she said, sitting up, pulling the blanket around both our shoulders, her hand finding mine under the fabric like it had already decided that was where it belonged. Whatever it is, I'd rather hear the true thing than a kind one. "I don't know how to be someone who stays," I told her, honest for the first time all the way through. "I've spent 10 years building a life specifically designed so I'd never have to find out if I could. And you're the first place I've ever wanted to try, and I don't have a plan for that, and it terrifies me more than the storm did." She was quiet a moment, her thumb moving slowly over my knuckles. "I'm not asking you to have a plan," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me the truth as it changes, instead of disappearing to somewhere convenient every time it gets complicated. That's all Denny ever actually needed from me, and I couldn't do it. I'm trying to do it now." And if I go to Lisbon, then I hope you go knowing exactly what you're choosing, instead of running from what scared you, she said. That's the only thing I actually need. Not a promise. Just the truth, however it lands. We stayed like that a long while, the blanket around our shoulders, the fire popping quietly in the grate, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't planned on saying, about the apartment in Anchorage I'd kept for 6 years and barely lived in, furniture still in boxes because unpacking felt like admitting I planned to stay somewhere, about the way I'd learned, very young, that leaving first hurt less than being left, and had built an entire career out of that one small, sad piece of arithmetic. That's a lonely way to live, she said, without judgment, just naming it. It worked for a long time. Working isn't the same as being good for you. I didn't have an answer to that, because she was right, and because some truths don't need a response so much as room to sit in the air for a while. She made tea eventually, and we drank it slowly, and outside the window the storm had gentled into something almost peaceful. Snow falling straight down for the first time in 2 weeks instead of sideways, like even the weather had decided to stop fighting. I thought about the caribou photograph, about the life I'd built out of never staying anywhere long enough to be disappointed by it, and understood, lying there in a cabin 800 miles from anyone who knew my name, that I had finally found the one place worth being disappointed by, if it came to that, because the alternative, leaving without finding out, felt, for the first time in a decade, like the actual failure. Later that morning, while I was still turning all of this over, she got up to check the stove and came back with 2 mismatched mugs and a look on her face I hadn't seen from her before. Something almost shy, which didn't suit her usual bluntness and was somehow more affecting because of it. I made a decision last night too, she said. While you were asleep. I decided that if you go, I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen so it hurts less later. I'm going to let it have been exactly as real as it was, however it ends. That's either very brave or very reckless. Turns out at my age, those are usually the same thing. She handed me a mug, sat back down, tucked her feet under the blanket beside mine. I spent 6 years being careful, so nothing could hurt me again. I'd rather be hurt by something real than safe from something that never happened at all. I didn't tell her, in that moment, that I'd already made my own decision, quietly, sometime in the last 2 days, because I wanted to be sure it would hold before I said it out loud where it could be taken back. But I held her hand under the blanket a little tighter, and she seemed to understand that as its own kind of answer. For now. The plow came through on the 4th day after that. The sound of the engine strange and mechanical after 2 weeks of nothing but wind and fire and each other's voices. Betany and I stood at the window and watched it clear the last half-mile of road, and I felt her go very still beside me, bracing for a version of this story she'd already lived once. I called my editor from the radio that afternoon and told her, plainly, that I wasn't taking the Lisbon contract. Betany didn't say anything when I hung up. She just looked at me, waiting, the way she waited for weather to reveal its actual intentions instead of trusting the first read. I'm not doing this because of you, I said, which came out wrong, and I tried again. I am partly, but not the way you're bracing for. I'm not staying because I'm scared of losing you. I'm staying because for the first time in 10 years, I looked at a life that was mine to walk away from. And I didn't want to. That's different than being talked into staying. That's choosing it. I don't want to be your sacrifice, she said. I've watched what happens when someone gives up their whole life for a person. And it doesn't stay romantic for very long. It turns into resentment with really good manners. It's not a sacrifice. I showed her the photographs I'd taken over the last 2 weeks. Not just of her, though there were plenty of those, but of the valley, the woodshed, the frost patterns, the whole strange, quiet, demanding, beautiful world she'd built here alone for 6 years. Look at what I actually shot. I wasn't documenting a goodbye. I was documenting somewhere I wanted to stay. I didn't realize it until I looked at all of them together. She went through them slowly, and I watched something in her face change with each one. Watched her see, maybe for the first time, the place she lived through someone else's eyes. Someone who'd chosen to look at it the way she looked at everything. On purpose, and closely, and like it mattered. You'd give up the magazine job for this, she said, not quite believing it yet. I'm not giving it up. I'm negotiating a remote contract and keeping the parts of my life that are actually mine, and choosing, for the first time, to build the rest of it around staying somewhere instead of around leaving well. I took her hand. I got lost trying to photograph one last empty place before I let myself have a real life. Turns out the empty place had you in it the whole time. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she kissed me. The kind of kiss that isn't asking a question anymore. And when she finally pulled back, she was smiling, unguarded, the smile I'd been chasing with a camera for 2 weeks. Then I really do hope it never passes, she said. All of it, not just the storm. We spent that first evening after the road opened, not celebrating exactly, but sitting with the strange, quiet relief of two people who'd braced for an ending and gotten a beginning instead. The plow driver, an older man named Hollis, who'd been servicing this route for longer than Betany had been a ranger, stuck his head in for coffee and looked between the two of us with the barely concealed amusement of someone who'd clearly seen this particular plot develop before in other cabins, other winters. 2 weeks stuck in a storm with the loneliest ranger in the state, he said to me, grinning. Didn't expect you to still be smiling when I got here. Neither did I told him. And Betany, for once, didn't argue with the description of herself, just rolled her eyes and refilled his mug, and something about the easy domesticity of the moment. A stranger in the kitchen, her hand brushing my shoulder as she passed behind my chair, felt like the first real evidence that whatever this was, it could survive outside the storm's particular magic, in ordinary daylight, with other people watching. That night, once Hollis had gone and the cabin was quiet again, we didn't discuss logistics or contracts or Lisbon. We just sat by the window and watched the newly cleared road disappear into the dark, both of us fully aware it led somewhere now. And both of us, for the first time, in no hurry to find out exactly where. 3 years is not a long engagement by most measures, but by ours, two women who'd spent a decade each building lives specifically designed to avoid needing anyone, it felt like exactly the right amount of time to be sure, and exactly the right amount of time to be impatient. We got married in June, in the clearing behind the station, because Betany said if she was going to do this at all, she wanted to do it somewhere she'd actually chosen, and this was the place she'd chosen twice now, once for the solitude, once for me. My mother flew up from the lower 48, having finally, in 3 years, stopped asking when I was coming back to a normal life, and started asking instead when she'd get to see the northern lights. Betany's oldest friend from ranger training, a broad, kind woman named Delphine, who'd known her through the Denny years and the ones after, stood up as her witness and cried through the entire ceremony without apology. We wrote our own vows. Betany's were short, because everything Betany says is short. And she said, near the end of them, the sentence that had started all of this, turned inside out. You told me you were leaving when the storm passed. I've spent 3 years hoping, every single day, that the only thing that never passes is this. Mine were longer, because I talk when I'm nervous, but I ended with the truest sentence I had, that I'd spent a decade running from the exact kind of stillness I'd found in her, and that the biggest risk I'd ever taken with a camera was nothing compared to the risk of finally staying somewhere on purpose. It snowed that night, absurdly, in June, a freak system nobody predicted, just enough to dust the ground white while we danced under string lights in the clearing, and Betany laughed into my shoulder and said the mountains clearly had a sense of humor about us. I photographed almost none of it. For once, I let myself just be inside the moment instead of capturing it, trusting, for the first time in my career, that I would remember this one without needing the proof. Delphine gave a toast that started as a joke about Betany's legendary inability to text back within a week and ended, unexpectedly, with her crying harder than my own mother did, saying that she'd watched Betany build a fortress around herself for a decade and had genuinely worried, some winters, that nobody would ever be let inside it again. "I used to drive up here just to make sure she still remembered how to have a normal conversation," she said, half laughing, half sobbing. "Louise, I don't know what you did, getting lost in that storm, but thank God you're bad at reading trail markers." My mother, for her part, gave a shorter toast, mostly about how she'd spent a decade worrying I would never let anyone close enough to matter, and how relieved she was to be wrong. She'd brought, absurdly, a framed print of the caribou photograph, the one that started all of this, and gave it to us as a wedding gift, saying it seemed only right that the picture that first sent me toward Alaska should hang somewhere in the life I'd built once I got there. We hung it eventually, right by the front door of the cabin, where it still hangs now. The first thing you see walking in, and the last thing you see walking out. A reminder, I think, of how close I came to leaving before I ever really arrived. Our daughter Ruth is 7 now, and our son August is 4, and both of them have their mother's stillness and my restlessness in roughly equal parts, which makes for interesting mornings. Ruth wants to know, always, the same story, how her mothers met, and no matter how many times I tell it, she asks the same question at the end. "Were you scared, Mama, when you got lost in the snow?" "Terrified," I tell her every time. "And you weren't scared, Mommy?" she asks Betany, who is usually pretending not to listen from across the room while she fixes something that doesn't need fixing. "I was the most scared I've ever been in my life," Betany says, "just not of the storm." I still photograph the valley, though these days half my work is remote for a magazine that stopped asking me to relocate 3 years ago and started asking me instead to send back images of a place most of their readers will never see except through my eyes. Betany still walks the same trails she's walked for 2 decades now, though she takes Ruth with her most Saturdays, teaching her to read tracks in the snow the same patient way she once taught me. Last week, checking the forecast out of habit more than necessity, I saw the first system of the season moving in over the range, the kind that used to mean isolation, danger, 3 days minimum before anyone could get in or out. Now it just means an excuse to close the shop early, build up the fire, and watch the kids press their faces to the window waiting for the first flakes. "Storm's coming," I told Betany, the way I've told her 100 times over the years, and she looked up from the log she was writing in, the same kind of log, the hand-drawn maps, the careful attention she's paid this place for 2 decades now, and smiled the smile that still, after everything, undoes me a little. "Good," she said. "I hope it never passes." Neither of us was joking anymore, and neither of us ever really had been. Ruth has started asking lately, a second question after the first one. Not just whether we were scared, but whether we knew, right away, that it would turn out like this. I tell her the truth, which is that I didn't know anything right away, except that I was cold and lost, and that a stranger had appeared out of the white, and told me flatly that I was going the wrong way. I tell her that most of the good things in my life turned out to be the things I found by accident, walking in a direction I hadn't planned on, and that sometimes the wrong way turns out to be exactly the way you needed to go. August, who is 4 and mostly interested in whether the snow means he can build a fort, usually loses interest around here and wanders off to press his face against the cold glass. But Ruth stays, watching her mother finish the log entry she's been writing, watching me watch her. Some small, precocious part of her already understanding that this is the kind of story worth sitting still for. Outside, the first flakes finally start to fall, straight down, unhurried. Nothing like the sideways violence of the storm that first brought me here. Betany looks up, catches my eye across the room the way she has for 11 years now, And I think, not for the first time, that I got luckier than anyone has any right to expect, getting lost in a place cold enough to kill me, and finding instead the only home I've ever actually wanted to stay in. The snow keeps falling. Neither of us minds.